I'd like to continue our discussion of evolutionary theory today. And so we've talked about the mechanisms of evolution. We've talked about speciation and speciation events. And so I just want to now just come back to some other topics that help support and are supporting evidence for evolution and related topics to evolutionary theory. So first I want to talk about the fossil record. So again, as we look at other evidence for evolutionary theory, really the fossil record is one of these. And so again, sometimes you'll hear people in the non-scientific community talk about the fossil record and say, well, there are no intermediate forms, and so this is one of the weaknesses of evolutionary theory. And while it's certainly, we don't have a complete fossil record of all organisms, I mean, there are 1 million insects alone, for example, species of insects, it's not a reasonable expectation. The fossil record really does show us a lot of relationships between organisms, and we have abundant evidence of relationships between organisms in the fossil record. Now, one of the things I do want to discuss related to the fossil record is that, again, if we look historically at how people looked at evolution, certainly in Darwinian times, he looked at evolution as being kind of a slow, gradual process. But when we look at evolution, in some cases it is a gradualistic kind of process, but in other cases we see abrupt changes in the fossil record. And so there's this phenomenon that we see in the fossil record known as punctuated equilibrium, and so I would like to talk about that. So the idea behind fossil equilibrium, or the observation, is that when we look at the fossil record, we a lot of times see relative stability in the fossil record or slow gradual changes. And so we might have a number of different forms in the fossil record that have existed for, in many cases, a long time. And then something happens geologically, and we refer to these as extinction events. And so, for example, one of these extinction events occurred about 250 million years ago, what's known as the Permian extinction. About 90% of marine species don't make it through this geologic time period. And so, anyway, most go extinct at this time. Some survive this, organisms survived this Permian extinction, and then very rapidly evolved into a number of different forms. So we refer to this evolution into a number of different forms from a common ancestor as adaptive radiation. So again, following an extinction event, again, some individuals survive and rapidly evolve into a number of different related organisms. And so again, as we looked at the Permian extinction, one of the things that happened here is that prior to the Permian extinction, if we look at land animals, amphibians were the dominant land animal. Some amphibians and reptiles did survive. And then the surviving reptiles, one of the things they evolved into were a number of different types of dinosaurs. And so dinosaurs then dominate this next age for the next several million years. So again, as we continue forward then, these organisms evolved in a number of different ways until there was another extinction event. This is known as the KT extinction. And at this extinction event, the dinosaurs disappear. Mammals had evolved during this time period. They survive. And then they rapidly evolve into a number of different forms. So again, when we see this periods of relative stability, then dramatic change, followed by rapid evolution to a number of different forms, this is referred to as punctuated equilibrium. So relative stability punctuated by periods of rapid change. And again, this is perfectly consistent with evolutionary theory. Now, another thing that is sometimes contrasted primarily by non-scientists is the concept of microevolution versus macroevolution. And again, as far as a biologist is concerned, there's really no distinction. Evolution is evolution. And so again, we could go back to our original example where if I take one step and then another step and then another step, I can eventually be a distance of 10 feet apart. But if I keep taking steps, I can be 100 feet from where I started. I can be 1,000 feet. I can be 10,000 feet. I can be 1,000 miles if I'm given enough time and enough steps. So the same idea is in evolutionary theory is that, whereas some individuals will look at different types of mice and say, okay, well, I can understand how a house mouse and a field mouse and a deer mouse, could be related. And maybe how a mouse and a rat could be related, but, not how a mouse and a human could be related. That would be macroevolution. That's impossible. But again, if you look at all the steps in between, again, as I talked about before, certainly, yes, you can see the relationships between different types of mice. And then you can look at rats, and we have the black rat and the Norwegian rat, and we have pack rats and all kinds of other rats. And then you can see a relationship between the mice and the rats. And rats, as I talked about before, looks kind of like a small version of a muskrat. And a muskrat kind of looks like a beaver, and a beaver kind of looks like porcupine. So at what point is it not just microevolution and it is macroevolution? It's all just evolution, quite honestly. And again, we see evidence of this in the fossil record as well. So for example, if we look at vertebrate evolution, and in terms of intermediate forms in the fossil record, we see what are known as lobed fin fishes. Lobed fin fishes, an example would be the coelacanths. So they have kind of fleshy appendages, and actually they kind of use those fleshy appendages to just kind of crawl around more than just, in addition to just swimming. And again, we see intermediates in the fossil record where we see amphibian-like fishes. These amphibian-like fishes, then we see transitions into fish-like amphibians. And so again, some of the early amphibians, we see appendages that are very similar to some of the fishes. And then we see transitions into true amphibians. And then we see transitions into reptile-like amphibians, amphibian-like reptiles, and the true reptiles. Eventually, these evolve into mammals and birds and so on. But the point is that we see a number of transitions in the fossil record. And at what point is it microevolution and macroevolution? To us, it's just evolution. But the idea that there are no intermediate forms in the fossil record is just a bankrupt concept. There are a number of intermediate forms. And one of the places where we see this, of course, is in human evolution. Human evolution, actually, we have a lot of fossils that show us aspects of human evolution. So sometimes people will say to me, it's like, well, don't tell me I evolved from a monkey. And that's not what we're saying. What we're saying in evolution is that humans and apes share a common ancestral that was an ancestral ape. It's neither a modern ape, of course, neither is it a modern human. But we do share a common ape-like ancestor with modern apes. So it isn't that chimpanzees are evolving into humans. The idea is that chimpanzees and humans have a common ancestral ape ancestor. So when we look at ape and humans, if we look at simian versus human characteristics, and again, the specifics here aren't that important, but just to give you some examples, when we look at the ratio of the forearm to the torso, apes have very long forearms compared to their torso length, and whereas humans don't. The rib cage in apes is conical. It tapers outward, whereas ours is more cylindrical. Molars are big in apes, smaller in humans. Mandible is U-shaped as opposed to parabolic or rounded. The big toe in apes tends to be offset, somewhat like the thumb, whereas our big toe is in line. And of course, modern humans are clearly adapted for bipedal movement, whereas apes are not. Now, when we look at the human fossil record, then again, and looking at specifically at adaptations for walking, then again, the big toe is offset. If you look at the femur head, the angle where the femur meets the hip is at different angles in apes versus humans. The top of the tibia, which is our long shin bone, in humans it's more Y-shaped to support weight, whereas it's more T-shaped in apes. And then apes generally are adapted either for knuckle walking, sometimes for brachiating through trees, whereas we, of course, are bipedal. Now, again, looking at the fossil record then, if we look at a genus known as Australopithecus, it is essentially a transitional form. And so again, if we're looking for a quote-unquote missing link in the human evolutionary ancestry between modern humans and apes, really Australopithecus fits the bill because we see actually a number of transitions even within the Australopithecines. So again, they have a number of ape-like characteristics, which I have in red. And they also, though, have the bipedal adaptations for walking. So again, Australopithecus really does fit the bill as an intermediate form. And again, there were a number of intermediates here. So again, the first Australopithecine that was discovered is the famous fossil Lucy. There have since been a number of other types of Australopithecines discovered. Again, we do have, their anatomy tells us that they were upright walkers. And we also have evidence from the fossil record and footprints from the same time period showing us that they were walking upright as well. And this is an artist's rendition of what an Australopithecine might have looked like. So again, as we kind of look at this ancestry then, we look at Australopithecus afarensis as being a distant ancestor of modern humans. And there's a divergence then in Africa in Australopithecus. There's what's we known as a robust lineage, which were kind of the bigger, more physical types of Australopithecus. And they eventually go extinct. And then also there was a more gracile, what we call a more delicate lineage of Australopithecines as well. And so they coexisted in Africa at various times. And again, I'm leaving out a lot of intermediates here, but there are a number of other fossils in both of these lineages. And we believe it's this gracile lineage then that eventually gave rise to the Homo lineage, humans. And so Homo habilis is among the earliest of the hominids to have evolved, again, in Africa. And it's called Homo habilis, handyman, because tools are associated with those fossils. And then habilis gives rise eventually to Erectus in Africa, and Erectus was a very successful human, certainly not a modern human, but it radiated out of Africa throughout Europe, Middle East, and Asia. And again, there are other intermediates I'm leaving out here, but in Europe, and this is a picture of Homo erectus, what Homo erectus we think looks like, and a skeleton. And then Erectus in Europe eventually gives rise to the Neanderthals, and in Africa, and Neanderthals eventually go extinct, and in Africa gave rise to modern humans about 150,000 years ago. So anyway, this abbreviation MA is a reference to millions of years ago. So the time periods here aren't so important, but again, some of these major fossils I think are significant. So again, Homo sapiens eventually radiated out of Africa. They certainly encountered Neanderthals in Europe. They also encountered Erectus in other parts of the world. And so what's interesting here is, well, what was the interaction? When they encountered one another, did they see each other as the same thing or different species? And really, the vast majority of evidence suggests that we did not see each other as the same thing, even the Neanderthals and the humans. But there is still some lingering questions as perhaps whether Neanderthals and Homo sapiens might have integrated in some ways. But it's a very interesting area of research, trying to figure out, well, I wonder what happened here. And then also, as we look at Homo sapiens, we acknowledge what are known as anatomical modern humans, but we don't really see the cultural aspects of humanity until maybe 50,000 years ago or so. That's where we begin to see art. That's when we begin to see evidence of religion and things like that. So anyway, so that's also a very interesting area to look at in terms of human evolution. But again, we have the fossils that show us some of these intermediate stages. Also, when we go back to our simian lineage, well, how do you know that we evolved from apes? We share 98.5% of our genes with apes. Again, there's no other biological explanation for that except for a common ancestry, plus we have the physical evidence of intermediate forms in the fossil record. So again, for some people this may be uncomfortable, but it is a biological reality. Now, another thing I want to discuss too is that as we look at evolution, it's related to embryonic development. So again, one of the things we look at in looking at relationships of organisms is what we call developmental homology, shared characteristics in embryonic development, sometimes referred to as evo-devo. So changes in embryonic developmental genes then can lead to gross morphological changes. So again, we're a long way from thinking that small humans were in the sperm, and that's what led to big humans fertilizing the egg. And then there's also an ancient historic idea, which is also not really true, and it is the ontogeny, known as ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And what that is saying is that embryonic development mimics or replays evolution. So again, this was an idea in the 18 and 1900s, which really is not true. But what is important about development is that when we look at similarities and see similarities in embryonic development of organisms, what that traces back to then are shared genes. So we do see some evidence of evolutionary history in embryonic development, but embryonic development does not retrace necessarily our evolutionary history, but it does give us clues as to relationships of organisms, as would any genes. So again, as we look at vertebrates, for example, again, we share a lot of embryological developments. We start off as a fertilized egg, solid mass of cells, hollow mass of cells, and then this hollow mass will begin to form a primitive gut. And again, then other similarities occur beyond that. So there are a lot of similar features in our embryonic development and even later embryonic development. When you look at vertebrates, again, there are certain stages that look very much alike. We form these pharyngeal pouches. We form what's known as a post-anal tail. We, of course, reabsorb that. But again, there are obvious similarities in how all vertebrates develop. Again, we can even look at ape development. There are certain stages where the skull of apes and humans look very much alike before diverging significantly. And again, these are ancient common features. So we can even go back 500 million years ago and look at the fossils and actually see evidence of embryonic development that is very similar to what we see today. Also, again, sometimes organisms will show us their evolutionary history through what are known as atavistic structures. So for example, what an atavistic structure is an ancient structure, if you will. So sometimes you will see horses with extra digits being born. You see, for example, whales born with rear appendages. sometimes birds actually have the gene for teeth, and you can activate that gene, and birds can be induced to grow teeth in some situations. So again, the fact that they have genes for limbs tell us that they have ancestors with limbs, that they have genes for teeth tell us that they have genes for teeth, and so on. And that would trace back to an ancestor with teeth. So again, these developmental genes then are responsible for the different stages of embryonic development. There are specific genes that we refer to as homeobox genes, which generally code for proteins that are related to embryonic development. But one of the interesting things about comparing, for example, the chimpanzee and human genomes is that what we're finding is that the genes that code for proteins are very, very similar, but where we are seeing some of the differences in what are known as cis elements. And cis elements would be regions of DNA that code for RNAs that control developmental gene expression. So it's not so much the genes that are different, it's the timing and the amount of certain genes and when they are being expressed and how strongly they're being expressed that sometimes can relate to developmental changes. And then this in turn will lead to morphological homology, similarities in the physical structure of organisms at the molecular level, the fine anatomical level, and the gross anatomical level. So earlier we taped a little segment that looks at skeletal anatomy and some of the similarities and differences that we see in vertebrate skeletal anatomy, and so I'd like you to take a look at that right now. I'd like to take a few minutes and talk about skeletal homology. And so again, kind of historically, when we look at our approach to evolution and evolutionary theory, it really started with looking at the structure of organisms. And so again, we can look at skeletal homologies, see similarities in those skeletal anatomies. We can see differences that trace to differences in the reproductive development of these organisms, which eventually trace back to minor changes, typically in the genes responsible for development of those structures. So what I want to do is compare human skeleton, dog skeleton, and horse skeleton, and we just have the horse leg that we'll be looking at here. So we'll be looking at the human arm, dog leg, and horse leg, and looking at the similarities and differences between these. And then how this relates to their embryonic development and also their evolutionary history as well. So again, if we look at the horse leg here, I mean, one of the questions would be, are we looking at a foreleg or a hind leg of the horse? And so we can get a bit of a clue for that if we look at the dog skeleton. So as we look at the dog skeleton, you'll find that this upper bone here, which is known as the scapula, you would want to compare that to the foreleg of the dog or the hind leg of the dog. And you'll find in the hind leg of the dog, we do have a very similar type of bone. It's basically kind of a triangular bone with a ridge of bone down the center for muscle attachment. And so this is the scapula of the dog. When we compare that to our own human skeleton, again, on the back side of the rib cage, same locations we'd find it in the dog, we have a roughly triangular bone. And this triangular bone has a ridge of tissue for muscle attachment that runs down the center. So again, when we look at our own scapula, it's very much like what we see in the dog. And then again, that would mean then that as we look at the horse leg then, that this actually is a scapula as opposed to a pelvic bone, because in roughly triangular, we have the ridge of bone that runs down the center for muscle attachment. So again, so this is the scapula on the horse leg. Now, if we go back to the human anatomy then, the bone that articulates with the scapula is the upper arm bone known as the humerus. So this is a human humerus here. And as we look at the dog skeleton then, this would be the humerus. This is the bone then that articulates with the scapula, so the dog humerus is here. And then if we look at the horse skeleton, again we have the scapula, and then this large kind of gnarled bone down here is the humerus of the horse. And so again, if you look at the horse compared to the human and dog humerus, you know, it's quite a bit shorter relative to the limb length. It's very heavy, it's very gnarled up because of all the muscles that attach there. And again, as we compare these, a lot of times students will literally look at this and go, ew, it's like it's mutated. And that's exactly the point. So when we talk about evolution, you know, mutation, natural selection is really what's driving most of these changes that we see. Okay, now when we get to the lower arm bones of the human, the lower arm bones, we have two, and there's one's called the radius and one called the ulna. So the ulna is what locks the elbow, the radius is what lets us supinate and pronate our hand. So again, as we look at the dog, we will again see two lower leg bones, four leg bones here. So there's a radius and ulna here. The difference is that the radius doesn't really permit that supination and pronation like we have in our movements. And then as we look at the foreleg of the horse, you know, initially it looks like there's a single bone here. But if you look closely at this, what you see is that there is an ulna that locks the elbow, and then the radius here, and they actually fuse into a single bone in the lower, 2/3 of the bone or so. So we refer to this as the radio-ulna. And again, it starts out as two bones. So again, they have the genes for two bones, but they fuse together to form a single bone. So there's a mutation in developmental genes that cause these two to fuse later on, as opposed to staying separate bones. And again, that's a good thing for the horse, because the horse has to support a tremendous body weight, and a single large bone is better off for their anatomy than two smaller bones would be. Okay, then as we continue, if we go back to the human, the next series of bones would be the wrist bones, which are the carpals. So they'd be the carpals of a human. As we look at the dog anatomy, so we have the radius and ulna here, so here would be the carpals of the dog. So this is where the wrist bone of the dog is. And then in the horse, as we come over here, these would be the horse carpals here. Okay, and again, tremendous homology here. Continuing on, if we go back to the human, now in our hand then, these long bones of the hand, which make up the back of the hand or the palm, these are the metacarpals. And notice, of course, that we have 5 digits. The dog also has, 5 digits, and so it has its metacarpals here. And then as we look at the horse leg, again, it appears to be a single metacarpal when you look initially. But again, embryologically, what's happening here, and I'm going to turn this so you get a better look at this on the back side. But what actually happens is in their embryonic development, they actually produce 3 metacarpals in what essentially is comparably to the back of their hand, and then they fuse together, so that we actually have 2 little metacarpals and then a large metacarpal here. So again, as we look at their embryonic development, they produce multiple digits initially, and those digits are reabsorbed and fused eventually to form a single digit, as we'll see as we move more distally here in a second. And again, that's also interesting because, again, they're showing us something about their evolutionary history, because when we look at the evolution of the horse ancestors evolved from 3-digited horses, and eventually, if you keep going back, you go back to 5-digited animals. And then, as we look at the digits, again, if we look at the human hand, we have the digits composed of bones called phalanges. We have proximal, middle, and distal phalanges, as do the dogs. So the dogs would have proximal, middle, and distal phalanges in their digits as well. The most distal phalange is covered by the claw. And then again, as we come down into the horse leg here, at this point then they do have a single digit. So again, a proximal, middle, and distal phalange. But again, it matches up bone for bone with our hands. It's just that instead of multiple digits, they have a single digit. So again, the digit they end up walking on actually is the middle finger. So horses are walking on their middle fingers and their middle toes. And then as you can see here, the hoof actually is essentially a modification of the nail, or would be homologous to our nail. And then the sole of the hoof would be essentially like a calloused finger, if you will. So again, they're way up on the top of their digits here as they walk around. And again, start off with multiple digits. Eventually we have 3 metacarpals, and eventually are walking on single digits, the middle finger, middle toe. Now, a couple of other examples of some interesting homologies that we see to other animals, not so much us, but this is a more ancient group of animals, the reptiles. But if we look at this turtle shell, I think it's kind of interesting as well compared to other reptiles. So reptiles, like mammals, tend to have rod-like ribs. And of course, the vertebrae would be separated by cartilage to allow flexibility in the movement of the backbone and so on. But when you look at a turtle shell, what you notice is that they certainly do have vertebrae, and embryologically, they would develop separate vertebrae, but then the vertebrae fuse together to produce a bony vertebral column. And then also, as you can see here, the ribs, start off being rod-like in embryonic development, but then they flatten out and become slat-like, basically like boards. And these board-like ribs grow together then, and so this is what creates what we call a bony carapace. So the shell, in other words, if you've never thought about it, well, what is the shell of a turtle? Well, what it is, internally, it's bone composed of ribs and a vertebral column that's all fused together. And then externally, it's composed of scales. So they protect externally, which is the same kind of composition as our fingernails. So again, it's like, ew, it's like it's a mutant. It's like it's a mutant reptile. That's exactly the case. But nature found a use for those mutations. And then going back to mammals real briefly too, kind of an interesting discovery here recently, I'll move this human skeleton over a little bit, is that when you look at the anatomy of a bat, you can see, of course, that the bat wing is largely composed of the hand. These are actually called the chiroptera, which means the hand-winged animals. And so again, the thumb is sticking up here, and then we have the other 4 digits which help make up the wing. But notice how elongated the hand is. But again, composed of proximal, middle, and distal phalanges, just like our own hands. Carpals, metacarpals. One difference is that the radius and ulna actually are fused in this particular animal. Now, what's interesting is that some researchers found, when they were looking at bat anatomy and actually reproductive development, that there was a certain gene that was hyperactive during hand development. And so they thought this might be responsible for the elongation of the digits. And so they genetically modified mice then to overexpress the same gene, and what they found was that the mice digits were many times longer than what would be normal. So again, this is an example of where we can look at differences in embryonic development, trace it to a genetic cause, and then also really trace that to evolutionary differences in organisms. So anyway, I hope you find this interesting. Again, it's kind of what I really am interested in is showing you that there is a lot of evidence for a common ancestry of organisms and how little tweaks in the genes responsible for embryonic development can lead to gross morphological changes. Now, one other thing I want to mention too is that, again, there are other evidences of evolutionary homology, if you will, too. And for example, behavior. One of the reasons we study animal behavior is to learn about animals and how they interact, but it's also to learn about ourselves. So things like aggression, foraging behavior, and so on. These are all basically instinctual behaviors that have a genetic basis. So I guess what I want to summarize here is that as we look at evolutionary theory, again, in the public's mind, it's quote unquote just a theory. But from a biologist's perspective, it's just another phenomenon. And it's no different than reproduction. I mean, we can look at reproduction as being some miraculous event, but really not. It's a biological event. We can look at growth. My children were just babies, it seems like yesterday, and now they're in college and beyond. And that seems like a miracle, but that was a biological phenomenon, as is evolution. And again, it is something that has been supported by a number of different lineages, lines of evidence, tremendous evidence to support it, and it is really the primary biological explanation for the common ancestry of organisms. That's it for now. See you next time.